I can't tell you how deeply I detest the idea that a series of ideas, that our culture is a oppressive patriarchy. That's the best way to conceptualize it, and that the appropriate way to view history is the domination, the endless domination of women by men over the course of the last several thousands of years, and that any attempt by young men to manifest any ambition or competence is equivalent to power, and all they're doing is taking their place in the pathological culture. All of that to me is, it's one-sided to start with, but I think it's appalling beyond description. And so, no, I certainly haven't become any less repelled by that. And the fact that, I also know more clearly than I did when we talked, to what degree that's a minority view. I mean, there was a good political science study published a week and a half ago or so that the Atlantic Monthly commented on, showing that only 8% of Americans hold the ideological position that would push that view forward, and even 30% of them think that it's gone too far. And so not only do we have this insane narrative that's driven by ignorance and resentment, but it's generated by a tiny minority of people, many of whom themselves even believe that it's gone too far. One of the things that is typically and thoughtlessly put forward is the idea that male aggression, let's say, is something that should be inhibited or suppressed, or that perhaps boys should be socialized like girls, which I think is a dreadful idea. And in a boxing establishment, obviously the capacity for aggression is something that's not only allowed but developed, but it's brought under control. And I think that sophisticated psychologists understand, and sophisticated people understand, that you don't make men harmless by making them weak. You make them useful and responsible by helping them bring their capacity for mayhem and aggression under long-term, conscious, careful control. And that's part of the respect. One of the things about boxing, and this is true of any sport, I would say, is that you have to learn to take a blow, and you have to learn to control your temper. And that's a big deal, because a lot of aggression, violent aggression goes astray when it's impulsive. And all the men that I've met who were worthy people had a tremendous capacity for aggression, but it was contained and controlled. And so then they could use it carefully and voluntarily when it needed to be used. And it gave them a certain amount of, I would say, dignity, but it also was part of what made other people around them respect them very, very rapidly. And I've seen this at every level of the hierarchy of different occupations, even very sophisticated occupations. And so to integrate that aggression is much, much, much better strategy than to try to repress it out of existence.
Well, you say there are whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile towards men. These are the areas of study dominated by the postmodern neo-Marxist claim that Western culture in particular is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women. You've got only 7 women running the top FTSE 100 companies.
Yeah.
So it seems to a lot of women that they're still being dominated and excluded, to quote your words back to you.
It does seem that way, but multivariate analysis of the pay gap indicate that it doesn't exist. But there's multiple reasons for that. One of them is gender, but it's not the only reason. Like, if you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis. Like, you say, well, women in aggregate are paid less than men. Okay, well, then we break it down by age, we break it down by occupation, we break it down by interest, we break it down by personality. I'm saying that the claim that the wage gap between men and women is only due to sex is wrong.
I'm saying that 9% pay gap exists.
Yeah.
That's a gap between men and women. I'm not saying why it exists, but it exists. Now, if you're a woman, that seems pretty unfair.
You have to say why it exists.
But do you agree that it's unfair? If you're a woman...
Not necessarily.
And on average, you're getting paid 9% less than a man. That's not fair, is it?
It depends on why it's happening.
And why do you think the outcome, and these countries where the outcome is more equal, why do you think that leads to bigger differences between the sexes?
Because there's only 2 reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect. There are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer. You have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women.
I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.
Yes, but the other thing I should say about this, what's necessary to understand about this is this is not a contentious issue among informed scientists. We've known this for 25 years. And so, and it's a perverse effect. No one expected it.
Would you accept that women have lacked opportunities, that they've lacked, the nudge has not operated in the same way? So for you to say, they end up...
Over what time span?
Well, you can choose your time span, say 100 years if you like.
I would
don't
say
really mind the time span. The point is, are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others?
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the socio-cultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it, or some proportion of it, but it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape. And we didn't fix that till the 60s.
That's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
Very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance? difference here precisely. What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
So you're not happy with the APA's recent guideline
I am
on
absolutely ashamed to call myself a psychologist in the aftermath of the APA's
Let's just say what it is. What exactly did they say?
Well, they said it was guidelines for the treatment of boys and psychological treatment of boys and men. But that isn't what it is. It's a social justice treatise on how you better think if you're a psychologist, if you don't want to be pursued. That's exactly what it is.
But what they actually said was that traditional masculinity was harmful. And one of the arguments
they said
they made
for two reasons. Compromised the mental health of boys and men and presented a social danger. And it's an absolute bloody lie. And here's how you know. It's very straightforward. Biggest risk factor for long-term delinquency, antisocial behavior, and violent criminality.
In boys,
fatherlessness.
Fatherlessness.
Right, okay, so let's walk through it. Okay, so the idea is that boys are socialized to be pathologically masculine by men. We're assuming they're fathers. Okay, so then why is it in families with no fathers that everything falls apart? And then, like, no one disputes that that's the case. They don't cover that in that damn article. So, and then they also assume that aggression is socialized. It's like, no, aggression is innate. Peacefulness is socialized. And how is it socialized? Well, men, for example, one of the things that men do with their young boys is wrestle with them. They rough and tumble play with them. Well, what is that? Well, it's aggression. It's like, no, it's not. It's play. And what do you do when you're rough and tumble playing? It's like you show the boy, and the girl too, because it happens with girls, how much they can exert themselves physically and still have the game continue. What hurts and what doesn't, how far someone else can be pushed, how much feinting and tactical maneuvering you can do, how much you can be extended, how you can trust if you're thrown in the air. Like, these things are fundamentally important. And men do a lot of that. And they regulate it's such, that article is just, it's absolutely scandalous what they've done. They've inverted it's not even wrong. It's anti-truth. Most of the people who see my live shows, and I probably watch the videos, are young men from, say, 25 to 35, not that young. And they're an audience that isn't generally reached by this sort of thing. And they're not there for political reasons or radical reasons. They're there to get their lives together. And many of them get their lives together. They drop their addictions, they drop their alcoholism, they increase their ambitions with regards to their jobs, they take on more responsibility. They marry their girlfriends, they fix their families, they're in much, much better shape. Boys are underperforming girls at every academic level. They drop out far more frequently out of school. And out of university. They're bailing out of the humanities and have been for 20 years. There won't be a man left well, it's very unfriendly to be a man in the humanities at universities. I don't know why in the world you would be. The constant discourse is that Western civilization, although primarily a product of men apparently, which isn't something I particularly agree with, is fundamentally oppressive and patriarchal and destructive, and that any sign of ambition on your part as a male is nothing but indication that you're participating in the same oppressive structure. And so anything that's ambitious or noble or forward-looking or characterized by fortitude is actively discouraged and punished, and it's very, very disheartening. I think that there's active attempt to criticize, what would you say, active masculinity from a very early age, and it's unbelievably damaging. And it will, of course, spread over into women too, because insofar as women take on masculine roles and masculinity itself is criticized, then that will backfire, and that'll happen soon enough.